And we're back. There are the loudest birds in the history of birds outside of this window today. So unfortunately, I cannot do anything about the cawing because now it's like 8 o'clock and I've been waiting for hours to record this video. So we are now on module 4. If you don't know me and for some reason you're watching this video, even though you're not in my class, just, I don't know, click my YouTube and read stuff. Okay. Module 4, video 1. So there are 2 modules in this, plus you have a baby video that I'm going to pause in the next video. So you have 2.5 videos to watch. And this video is entitled Relational Dialectics or Brain Fuckery Part 2. So at the end of module 3, God, these birds are so loud. I love birds though, so good for them. At the end of module 3, we talked about just straight up dialectics, right? And dialectics, remember, are tensions that are in your language because every word contains its opposite. And when you use words, you're always sort of navigating the fact that what you're saying implies its opposite. You're never just using a word and then it's that binary thinking. You're never just saying one thing and then, oh, that other thing doesn't apply to me. The other thing always applies to you. So I won't refresh that because that was a long-ass module, but you can go and you can watch it. Now, what we're talking about in this, now that we've switched from sort of how language works, we're looking specifically in this unit at interpersonal relationships. And so we're looking at relational dialectics. And so most people find this particular unit actually easier to process because it's more about your relationships. But your relationships are also a sign, right? So your relationships, like my girlfriend or whatever, that relationship has a bunch of meaning that are attached to it, and it means contradictory things at the same time. So your relationships, just like your identity, just like your word choice, all kind of are tensions, right? They're these dialectical tensions. So the person who invented this relational dialectic theory is Leslie Baxter, but Leslie Baxter owes it to Mikhail Bakhtin, who was a linguistic semiotic literary theorist, also Jacques Derrida, and there are a bunch of, anyway, and you don't need to know the names of these people, but I always like to point out that social science theory, like Leslie Baxter's theory of relational dialectics, always kind of owes its origin way, way back to the humanities because I'm a humanities scholar, not a social scientist. So anyway, I know you want to do nothing with that information, but I'm going to put it out there because who knows who's watching this thing. So the theory of relational dialectics, which is from the 80s, but again, this stuff goes back to way, way, way back, defines communication patterns between relationship partners as the result of this endemic and ongoing dialectical tension, right? So every relationship is just the constant tug of war of a set of tensions. So relational dialectics is the emotional and value-based version of the philosophical dialectic. So what we talked about in the previous video is a rhetorical dialectic, which is the way that your symbolic communication and persuasion is always this tug of war. This is the emotional, relational version of that, but there are similar philosophies. And so the metaphor that people use a lot for dialectics that I guess kind of works. I don't know because I actually don't know that much about this metaphor because it's the yin and the yang, right? It's that white and black symbol that has the swirl and the circles. And if you look at the symbol, half of it is black, half of it is white, but then on the black side is a white dot and on the white side is a black dot. So you can look up yin yang. It's a pretty common symbol. And the idea here is that in that yin and yang, the one side, which is the dark, and the other side, which is the light, always contains the seeds of its opposite. So dark can't exist without light, and light can't exist without dark. And it's more of a circular, what we call a dialectical relationship, right? The both and, as opposed to an either or, right? Which would just be black over here and white over there. So for example, I think, and part of the reason I don't use the yin-yang metaphor, I only bring it up because it's really common, is because that comes from some type of Eastern religion / philosophy, and I just don't feel comfortable appropriating that because I don't know that much about it. But one thing I think I can talk about is if you've ever seen those like breakup symbols. So if you see the heart and it's got the crack in the middle and it's kind of falling apart, there's this idea that now you and the other person are just separate, right? You're not in tension anymore. You've just broken. And that's true once the relationship is kind of over, although we all know, right, you can keep a relationship with an ex going for a long time in your head. But when you're in a relationship and there's been heartbreak and you're still in that relationship, even though, yes, you are two sides of the same sort of symbol that have broken, you still contain the seeds of each other because in a relationship that you're currently participating in, it's never just I'm out or I'm in. You're always kind of out and kind of in at the same time. So whatever metaphor there works for you, but again, a relational dialectic is the idea that every relationship is a tension between competing desires. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a tension between you and me. So myself and you, if we're in a relationship, we don't have to be in a constant tug of war because we can be together, working together to navigate the tensions. The tensions are part of the structure of all relationships. So every relationship navigates the same set of tensions. The tug of war isn't between us. So we can be on the same page navigating the tug of war, right? Or we can be on opposite ends of the tug of war. I mean, it kind of depends, but very successful relationships are people who kind of get that all relationships have these tensions and they work together to figure out how to navigate them. And one of the most fucking frustrating things about this class is that the better I get at interpersonal communication, the more I have to sit with other people and say, like, you know, this really isn't a problem that we're having. It's just a dialectical tension that's endemic to relationships. And then they look at me and they're like, oh, you with your smart PhD talking. And it's kind of like, well, I mean, it's true. So you can like get on board and solve this problem with me, or you can continue to just fight with me as if you can be right and I can be wrong. And that's just the only outcome. So it's frustrating to sort of have this perspective on relationships when other people won't join you. But again, that's just kind of the nature of language. Some people want to acknowledge its complexity and some people want to acknowledge the complexity of relationships, which makes for more robust, nuanced, fulfilled relationships. And some people just want to pretend like there's only one way to do things and, you know, I don't know, like maybe you reconsider how much time you want to spend with those kind of people. All right, so when two people are in a relationship, one can desire to be open in the relationship and like expose certain parts of their life with the other person, certain parts of their personality, but at the same time, that individual can also like want to protect themselves and hide things where they may not want to share everything with someone and their partner. Both of these feelings can exist at the same time. So to use an example that I think is pretty common, hopefully, it's always tricky like which examples you choose because who knows if my perception of what the person on the other end of this camera is like is true. But if you've ever seen that show Gossip Girl, there's this scene where after, I think her name's Lily, it's the blonde's mom, gets with Rufus, who's like the musician that's Dan's dad, and they decide they're going to write down all the people they've ever had sex with. Because they want to be so open, right? They're both like, we just want to get it all on the table and no more lies, and we're just going to be totally transparent. And then Lily sees Rufus's list, which only has like 8 people on it, and Lily's has like 40 or something. So she rips up the extra page and throws it in the garbage. So she was all on board with openness and until she realized that being open in that context would actually make her vulnerable because she didn't realize that they had differences on this and she thought she would be judged. So she throws away and she closes off part of herself. But she still desires to be open, right? So it's the both and. You want both at the same time and you have to navigate wanting two things that you essentially cannot have. So that's kind of the basic principle of relational dialectics, wanting two things at the same time that kind of cannot exist perfectly together and having to always navigate the tension. Now, there are 4 main concepts that form the backdrop of relational dialectics, as well as 4 sort of major assumptions. Relational dialectics, first of all, this theory, and some of this is going to be repetitive from last time, but it's a tricky theory, so I don't think there's any downside to repeating it. Relational dialectics assumes, 1, that relationships are not linear. So you can develop a certain type of dialectic like, oh, we want more openness or we want more closeness. And then something can happen and you can go back to closeness, right? You're always navigating the tension. So it's not like, and some people think that if we're very, very open and then suddenly we close off from each other, that means that the relationship is moving backwards because forward movement must always mean more openness and only backward movement means more closeness. That's not true, right? Because if you lean too far to one side of the dialectic, like too far to the side of openness, you're going to have to bounce back a little bit because that's why it's a tension. If it were just an evolutionary thing where you were just leaving closeness behind, then relationships would just come to be more and more open. But that's not the way it works because openness always implies closeness in some way. So 1, relationships are not linear. So that means if you have to change how you're doing things, that doesn't mean that you're going backward. 2, relational life is characterized by change, right? You are always trying to change, address new dialectics, bringing up new ways of doing things. 3, contradiction, right? So contradiction is the idea that two things don't agree is a fundamental fact of relational life. Your relationships are nothing but giant bundles of contradiction. All you do is manage the contradiction. That's all relationships are. It's just managing the contradiction. You will never resolve the contradiction. It will always be there. And 4, communication, right? So the act of meta language, the act of clarifying your signifiers, all that stuff is central to organizing and negotiating relational contradictions. So part of the reason we use communication is not, see, this is where it gets tricky. People think this class is going to teach you how to do things so that you never have contradiction again. What I hope this class teaches you is 1, contradiction is all there is. 2, here's how to have a better attitude about contradiction. And 3, here are some strategies for managing contradiction that you haven't tried before that won't make the contradiction go away, but it may make it more bearable, and hell, it might even become fun. You might even become the kind of person who, when you realize that a dialectical tension has reared its head in your relationship, instead of getting all fucking upset about it, you're like, sweet, this is a chance for us to grow and come together and reassess our relationship. Or maybe it's a chance for me to dip, right? It all kind of depends. So those are the 4 basic assumptions of relational dialectics. And you could say the same thing about your language, right? Language is not linear, so we might evolve in a certain realm, like we all of a sudden love the concept of diversity in the 90s, and then we start to backlash against it because, of course, the more that diversity becomes a thing, the more that the opposite of diversity shows up, right? Because of that tension. Language is characterized by change, right? You can't just have a signifier mean the same thing forever, and contradiction is a fundamental fact of language. And then, of course, communication, as in meta language, right? Talking about how you talk about language is central to organizing and negotiating the use of language, right? And its contradictions. All right. In addition, there are these 4 core concepts of dialectics, some of which we've talked about. So contradictions are like the core concept of relational dialectics. You can't get relational dialectics if you don't get contradictions. And contradictions and dialectics, and for me, I mean, honestly, if you want to talk about them as like ongoing contradictions, that's just another way for me of saying relational dialectics. And they both mean the same thing, which is this kind of dynamic, right, meaning ongoing and active interplay between sort of what they call unified opposites. Those are opposites that have to be together. So we think of opposites as 2 things that don't fit together, but there are these things called unified opposites, and they're also sometimes called constitutive contradictions. And what that means is these 2 things that should not go together and yet somehow they do, right? Equality and independence. Separation and connection. Freedom and equality, right? Okay, unity and division. All right. Intimacy and distance. I mean, there's tons of them. So here are some of the principles in relational dialectics you kind of have to wrap your head around. So first of all, there's this concept of totality. So totality suggests that contradictions in a relationship are part of a unified whole and cannot be understood in isolation. So you cannot look at the way that a couple or a relationship, right, because not all relationships are couples, is disconnecting from each other without looking at the ways that they're connected. And this is important because when you're in a disagreement with someone that you're in a relationship with and they're talking all about how, oh, like you're not connected anymore and you don't connect, well, that can't possibly be true, right? There must be places where we're connecting because you can't have disconnection without connection. So the dialectics cannot be separated out and they're intrinsically connected to each other. For example, the tension between dependence and independence cannot be separated from the tension between openness and privacy. Both kind of work to condition and define each other. Then there's this concept of praxis, and Praxis. And practice is a term that sort of means like in practice. In practice, the dialectical tensions are created and recreated through the active participation and interaction of individuals. So in other words, the practical experience of having a relationship exposes one to the imposition of the needs and values of the other. Meaning, you can't have a relationship in practice if you're not willing to engage in tensions, right? So there's this idea that the only way you can have a relationship that is free of tension and contradiction is if it's only in your mind. That's why you can have, for example, a TV relationship with no contradiction. Or you can have a TV relationship that resolves a contradiction and it never comes up again, because those aren't real relationships, right? They don't have any praxis. But if you want real relationships, this is just part of the deal. So praxis focuses on the practical choices individuals make in the midst of the opposing needs and values, right? Dialectical tension. In turn, the choices you make to respond to those tensions create, recreate, and manage the nature of the relationship and also the tensions that you're going to experience. So it's practice and its totality are two of the sort of most important of the four concepts. And there's also a few others. But actually, now that I'm thinking about it, those are good. Let's just focus on totality, and let's also focus on praxis. There's also process, but I mean, that we pretty much already covered that. So yeah, I'm going to leave it as just those two. I think that's enough. All right. Every relationship is made up of 6 core tensions. And I think this is helpful too, because you can realize that your relationship is a contradiction. I mean, that's like kind of the noob level of this. Like you start to realize, oh, my relationship is just a series of tensions. But where you can really level up is once you can label the tensions, and there are so many. Oh my God, there's like an infinite amount. But if you can label a couple of core tensions, it's kind of cool, because I always like to remind people that you should try whenever possible to make it a process problem, not a you problem. So if you and your partner are in this phase, or you and your best friend, or you and a parent or whatever, and I'm sure a lot of you, especially if you're traditional college age students, are experiencing like some tensions with your parents due to the fact that you're getting older and you're going to college and you want more independence, but you're still dependent on them. And again, this is a very heteronormative assumption, because not all of you currently have parents, not all of you are in college as young adults. So I shouldn't even say most of you listening, but Geneseo is a pretty traditional demographic campus. So it's fair to say that a good number of you are, but even if you're not, you still have dialectics all over the place. It's just, I'm choosing one example, right? So you probably are experiencing a lot of them, and it's really helpful to be able to say, okay, the reason we're having trouble right now is because of a process problem, which is we're having a dialectic between X and Y. So we need to manage that dialectic. It's not about me and it's not about you. Because if you make it about you and them, you've missed the point, right? You've gotten too focused on the micro and you're not thinking on the macro level. And this happens a lot, for example, with grade appeals. So I have a student who comes to me and they're like, hey, I don't like this grade that I got. Or hey, I missed this test. Now my grade is bad. Can I have extra credit? So that's a tension, right? Because the individual wants what they want. I, however, am not responsible to just making the individual happy or successful. I'm also responsible for establishing a set of fair standards for 40, 50, 60, 75 people, right? So for me, there's always that tension between the individual and the collective. One person's needs versus everyone's needs. The micro versus the macro. And I always have to balance those. And sometimes it works. Because, for example, if a student... I'll give you an example. At the end of last semester, a student came to me and they were like, yeah, I did not understand the syllabus, and now I submitted a project late and I have to take the final exam, but I didn't know I had to take the final exam because I didn't read the syllabus correctly and I didn't ask for clarification, and I thought I was exempt from the final exam because I attended all of the classes. So now I have made plans and bought a plane ticket to go home for the final exam, but you're telling me I have to take the final exam. And so now I'm in this weird spot, because on the one hand, like, I don't want to screw this student over. They bought a plane ticket home. They, let's suppose that they genuinely had a misunderstanding. I'm fine. I'm willing to give someone the generous read. But it's like, okay, so I'm supposed to give you an exception, but then everyone else in the class still has to take the final, even though maybe they also misread the syllabus, right? So I'm in this weird position where I have to navigate that tension. And one thing I do is, from now on, I make it a lot clearer what the syllabus policies are, because I don't want what happened to this student to happen to everyone else. So that's one way I manage the tension. In this particular case, though, that student, there were only like 6 people that had to take the final. So I said, okay, well, what if I make the final take home? I'll email you the final that morning. You've got 3 hours to do it, and you email it back. And they were like, great, that would totally solve my problem. So what I did then is I took the solution that I made for them and applied it to everybody. So everybody took a take-home final. Of course, there were people who didn't like that. They were like, man, I really would have wished we just did the final that you had planned in class, because now I got to take it home. And now what if I'm, I don't have, like, the fear isn't there. And I prepared for a certain kind of final. And now, so it didn't solve the problem permanently. It was just kind of a better solution in this case than choosing the collective that everyone has the same standard over the individual. But again, you're never going to get it right? Every time you go for the individual, the collective's going to show up and have a problem with it, and there is no fixing it. So it's not like I'm ever going to come up with a solution for late work or missed class or whatever that is going to make everybody happy. But I can manage that tension better by having more creative policies and by being able to engage with someone. So those are the core tensions that happen in practice, and you can never get away from them. So That particular core tension, though, is one between equality and inequality. So there are 6 of these tensions, and I'm just going to kind of like bang through them because they're pretty easy to understand. And again, I don't necessarily know that I need you to like memorize all 6, but it's kind of helpful to know all 6 because that way you can recognize them instead of having like one that you recognize and the rest of the time not having a label for what's happening. And so then you just think it's like you. Because I could easily think that like I'm a shitty person or they're a shitty person because of this conflict that we're having. But instead I'm just like, nope, it's not about you. It's not about me. It's about this tension. And that makes my life a lot easier because I don't have to feel guilty or bad about them or about me because it's a process problem, not an us, not a me, not a them problem. So here are the 6. And I gave you a chart, and certainly you're welcome to like take some notes on this. But generally speaking, I think you can kind of understand them. So first there's the autonomy connectedness dialectic. And that refers to the desire to have ties and connections with others versus the need to kind of be by yourself and to separate yourself as a unique individual. So an example would be like, I don't know, if you play sports and you want to be part of a team and you want to get the team, like help the team to win, and you want everyone to sort of hold their own weight, but also you'd like to highlight your own talents and you'd like to kind of run away with the ball and you don't want to pass and all that stuff. And so in NCAA, for example, because collegiate athletics is supposed to be more collectively based instead of individually based, and of course that's capitalism motivated because we don't want the NCAA athletes to get too individualized because of course then we'd have to start paying them more and give them royalty rights. You can't have individual celebration when you score a touchdown. Whereas in the pro leagues where it's much more individualized, we really encourage that kind of stuff because we want to make as much money on you as an individual as we can. But in the college circuit, because of the way that the economics of that system work, we discourage individual autonomy and celebration. And we say it's for the team environment, right? That autonomy connectedness dialectic. But really what we're saying is like, well, we don't want you to be too individual because then we'd have to actually start paying you as an individual celebrity, right? So that's that celebrity culture. How much autonomy, how much is it all me, and how much is it the collective? Okay, so that's 1. 2, openness and closeness. So we already talked about that one. That's how much of yourself you want to reveal and how much of yourself you want to keep private. So openness, so this is also the privacy and openness dialectic. It's whatever you want to call it. So this refers to the desire to be like open and sharing and divulge information and self-disclose, and the desire to protect yourself and be exclusive and be private. So for example, this happens a lot, I think, at work, in work environments. There's sort of this desire to let people know like who I am and what I'm about and what I'm up to, and to not have to filter and to not have to watch what I'm saying, but also there are like certain things I don't want to talk about. And obviously this is also an amount of privilege because the more that your identities are like not the norm, the less safe you are sharing. Right? So that's the autonomy closeness. And you're going to fall, typically most of us fall somewhere on the dialectic. Like I, for example, probably would be considered more open than I would closed. But for me, that's very much a tension. And I'm always thinking about how much of myself do I disclose and how much of myself do I keep private. All right, 3rd, novelty and predictability. So the novelty predictability tension is about the desire for a relationship or a connection with someone else to be predictable and safe and comfortable versus the desire for it to be like new and fresh and original, right? Unique. So like in this class, for example, I probably lean too much novelty, right? I want every theory to have its new edge. I want to explain everything my own way. I want to be coming up with new stuff to talk about. I want the projects to be new. I want the discussion to be edgy and cool, and I want to push the envelope, and I want to push the boundaries, and I want to keep you on your toes, and I want insightful policies. And that's fucking exhausting because you can't build schemas around that, right? You don't know what class is going to look like. You don't know. And so it's a tension. And for me, I think for your sake, probably fall too much on the novelty end. But, and even now, for me, from remaking these videos, I'm just sitting here like, oh my God, I really could have just let him read the fucking textbook. Because like dialectics are in the textbook. It's kind of a watered down, less interesting, not as nuanced version with kind of outdated references. But like, I don't know, maybe that's all this is to you. And maybe now there's just too much information. And so blah, 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 blah. So it's about always managing that tension. So you kind of can decide, am I more of a novelty person? In which case, like, how could I bring a little more predictability into the situation? So for you, for example, How could I make it so you have a better understanding of exactly when things are due? How could I make it so that every single module kind of looks similar so you start to get in the flow of what to expect? How can I make sure that you have a clear sense of what the expectations are in the quiz? Because I want you to feel safe and secure and be able to predict your surroundings. I mean, that's part of what enables you to learn. But, I also want to keep you on your toes and not just do what everyone else does. So it's about managing that tension by finding more creative ways. But again, I'm never going to get rid of it, right? It's always going to be there. All right, so those are the three sort of fundamental ones. And honestly, those three would get you a long way. So if you could just get those three, they tend to be the big ones. But there are three additional ones that I think are pretty interesting. And they're the ones that I think are more sophisticated and harder to manage. So one is favoritism and impartiality. So it's the desire to be treated fairly and like impartially, like I want to be treated just like everyone else. And this, the desire to be special. So like this is one of those moments where the openness, closedness is rearing its head, but also the novelty, predictability. Because obviously the favoritism, impartiality, the easy example here is like a professor and the student. Like, so that example I had with the student from the final, but like, here's another example. Like, I menstruate, right? I mean, not a shocker. And when I have my period, like I'm a non-binary woman, which is kind of a weird like signifier because like non-binary, like man is binary, but I'm a non-binary woman, and that's because I'm intersex, and that's a whole other thing. But it's still generally like speaking, like I present as a woman, and I like to be treated with fairness. I don't want anyone like telling me I have to go home because my brain is weak and I'm premenstrual, so I'm highly emotional. I mean, I would never want any shit like that, right? That shit would make me real mad. So that's the impartiality thing where I want to be treated like everyone else, but there are a couple times while I'm menstruating that I'm like fucking tired and I'm just like worn out and I'm low on iron, it can be tiring and exhausting, and I'm not like less capable or more emotional than anyone else, but it's just like sort of if you had a newborn at home who was crying all the time and you weren't getting enough sleep. I mean, it's just factually my body and my brain is sort of working on a little bit under like more duress than normal. So I kind of want favoritism, but I don't want that favoritism to be something that makes me seen as weak. So this is always the issue. Or I have, for example, like if you came up through the Geneseo EOP or AOP program, like you want favoritism because you're coming in behind the eight ball, and that's not anyone's fault. That's just the system that you got stuck in, what didn't give you the advantages that other people's system. And so yes, in some ways you want the extra help and the attention and the support that you need to reach your potential, which is there. It's just no one's ever helped you get there. But you also like don't want to be outed as being someone who got in through unusual means, and you don't want to be called out for being a part of this program, and you don't want to be treated as less than, and you don't want to be coddled. So again, it's always that tension that has to be navigated. All right. Instrumentality and affection. I love this one. So this is the degree to which your relationships are like a means to an end, right? Instrumental. You use them for something like an instrument. And the degree to which there's like this genuine feeling of connection. And that's that instrumentality affection. And this one I think causes a lot of problems for people because nobody wants to be told that the reason you're in a relationship is because you get certain benefits. Like, I'm not going to lie, 90% of the reason that I stay with my current partner is because they make my life a lot easier. They take care of the cars, they do the laundry, they prep all the food. I mean, they do shit that I don't have to do. And they stay with me, frankly, because I pay all the bills. So we can talk about how we're soulmates and we're deeply in love and we were meant to be together and all that shit. But for me, a lot of it is instrumentality. But that doesn't make me uncomfortable because I understand that there's an instrumentality affection dialectic and you need both. You wouldn't ever just like be happy in a relationship where all you did was use somebody for what you could get out of it. But at the same time, you can't just pretend that like you're with somebody because the gods struck down and Cupid flew the arrow and the cosmos collided and now you're a perfect fit for everybody, right? There's always going to be the tension, and just pretending like the tension isn't there just causes more problems instead of being like, you know what, this tension is just part of the deal and we're going to figure out what to do about that. Also, I'm using way too many hand gestures, so I'll put my hands down for a minute. And then the last one is equality and equality. And so again, this is like the idea of wanting to be connected as equals and also the desire to have levels of superiority. And I think this one is a big one for classrooms. So I want you to be my equal. Because like I don't want to coerce you and dominate you into submission. That doesn't sound fun for me. But at the same time, you're like just not. In some realms you are, right? If we were in a different context, in a different walk of life, yeah, you might totally be my superior. But when it comes to like how much you know about theory or how motivated you are or how much access you have to technology or how much practice you've had with this stuff, you're not. And that's good for you in some respects, right? You want me to sort of take the reins and teach you things and explain things to you and treat you kind of like novices, because if I expect too much of you, then you're going to fail. But at the same time, you want an equal say and you want to be able to advocate for yourself and you don't want to be condescended to. So again, that equality-inequality tension is just kind of pervasive to life. So it's about learning to get comfortable with the tensions, to recognize them when they're there so you make it a process problem, not a you problem, and then also to find more creative ways of using your meta communication, your problem solving, your language to try and come up with, if not a solution to those tensions because you can't solve them, at least maybe a way to address them that's more creative than binary thinking, right? Because all of this essentially is trying to get you away from binary thinking. So I put some good images in your study guide. So hopefully that helps you with those particular dialectics. And okay, one more actually. So this is good. So the dialectic model, the relational dialectic model, we already went over. And now I'm going to talk about how you can use the relational dialectic model to look at your family communication pattern. And we're going to talk a lot in the next video about how your family fucked you up. Because you have to understand how the dysfunction in your family has created patterns of behavior that your brain has very well greased the grooves of those behaviors, so that now whenever you engage in those behaviors, your brain likes it, not because it's like rewarding, but because it's rewarding so there's rewarding in like the higher self sense. So in the higher realm of self, rewarding is like, I'm achieving my purpose and I'm being respected, right? That's kind of like the higher self's sense of reward. But your higher self, which is your self-actualizing part of yourself, is always kind of competing with your sort of like what I call your emotional baby self. And that's the self that like has developed coping mechanisms and bad habits as a result of your family life. And that's not, it's just the way it is, man. Like, it's just the way it is. Growing up as a baby and a child is hard, and parents screw it up all the time, and that's not anyone's fault. It's just, it's hard, man. So you kind of have like both selves that are evolving, and they're always in tension. So again, more tension. And your family communication pattern sort of explains how you approach what you consider to be normal or desirable communication based on your grooves. But that doesn't mean that's how you're destined to be. So do not use the way that your family has been dysfunctional in the past, or the way that they set you up with certain expectations and patterns, as an explanation for why you do it now and an excuse not to change. Because how you behaved in the past has jack shit to do with how you behave in the future. How you behave in the past is a way for you to understand and gain awareness of what's going on with you now, so you can start making the changes for how to do it later. But what I do not want is for you to turn this into some kind of deep psychological, oh, well, my parents did it and we communicated this way, and so like that's just what I know and that's why I do it this way. No, it's quick and it's easy. Yo, I learned this pattern from my parents. That explains why I am where I am, but cool, that's done with. I'm not going to hang out in the past. I'm now in the present. This is where I got my work to do, and what do I want to look like in the future? Now, of course, that's easier said than done, because past and future you is the dialectic that we call the present, right? So all the present is a moment where you can look back and look forward. There is no actual present. Like, you can't point me to the present. Is the present right now? Oh, nope. Or was it like, what's now? Oh, did I just say it? Like, it's that phenomenon. So you're always in a tension between past and future, but most of us solve that tension by spending way too much time in our past and thinking about what we used to be like and what we used to do. And way too much time, like right now, just avoiding the hard work of change by buffering and watching TV and watching shit and playing video games and spending time with people who distract us from our problems and drinking or whatever it is you do, so that your present doesn't have to think about the fact that you're constantly stuck in a tension between where you were and where you want to be. So, don't use this as an excuse not to change or to do anything different. It's just a way for you to gain awareness of why you do stuff and how you've been conditioned to behave. But how you've been conditioned up to this point is only 20, 30, 40, maybe 50, 60 years of your life. You still have many, many years left to change that, okay? So when I talk about your family, Family, right? There's a signifier. It's a sign system of course there's going to be a ton of signifieds in there. And what I don't want to do is use the word family as a shortcut and make you think that what I'm talking about here is a nuclear family with like a straight mom and a straight dad who are both cisgendered, and they got married and they had sex and they had 2 kids, and one kid is this gender and one kid is that gender, and they're cisgender and they're probably white and they're probably middle income and they probably have all of this advantage. So we don't want to do that. So I will say, when I say family, F-A-M-I-L-Y, there's a difference between, first of all, your family of origin, right? That's the family of origin is the one, sometimes people call it your family of procreation, which is so gross. But your family of origin is the one that you had involuntarily, right? Your family of origin is the family that you kind of came from. So you didn't choose it. And it's so different for everybody, right? It's like, for some of us, we had a single parent, or we were in foster care for a long time, or we grew up with a biracial family, or we grew up in low economic conditions, or some of us, maybe our family of origin had money, but then our family didn't. I mean, there's just 100 ways to slice that pie. So one of the things I've tried very hard to do is when we talk about your attachment styles, I try not to base it on certain norms of family. So whether you grew up in a blended family or a divorced family or a single caregiver family or a family with an addict parent or a codependent family or a family with abuse cycles, or whether you grew up in foster care, whether you grew up not knowing who your biological parents were, you were adopted, or you were in the system, or you had a family that sort of had multiple parenting situations, or you had polygamous parents. I mean, I don't know, like, it all works. So I'm not going to make judgments about how anybody grew up. You grew up, shit happened, and now we're just going to focus on the communication patterns that you established in that family, irrelevant of whether your family is considered normal or not, because there are no normal families. So instead of your family of origin, I like to talk about your family of orientation, because your family of orientation is the one that you have now, or the one that you recognize, or the one that works for you. So it might be that you grew up and didn't know your biological parents, and your foster family is your family of orientation. Or maybe you grew up with a bunch of great friends and an uncle and a sibling, and you were close to those people, and they're your primary caregivers and the people that you go to for support. So that's your family of orientation. So when we talk about family, you choose whichever group of individuals, living or dead, has had the most influence in shaping you, and that's what we're going to call your family, F-A-M-I-L-Y, for the purposes of like talking about how your family has conditioned you to behave. All right. So this is the last model for this video. How are we doing on time? Holy shit, this is long. Oh my God, do I have thoughts about this? I know. And you think that this video is long, you should see what I delete as I'm writing. Also, at least you get to do this like in the comfort of your home. Maybe you got your headphones in and you're like zooming along campus, or maybe you're in your car, or maybe you got me on 2-speed and maybe you're skipping ahead. Imagine if you had to do this sitting in a lecture hall for 50 minutes while I went over all this stuff. So I'm hoping that this is a level up, but I don't fucking know. Like, this is one of the downsides to being a low self-monitor, is I do not think about whether or not this is working. I kind of just assume we'll try some shit, and we'll try the videos for a semester or two, and if you don't like them, well, there's 10 hours of my life I'll never get back, but cool, because if it's not working for you, then we probably need to try something else, right? So there's that novelty, predictability, tension. So last one, family communication patterns. All right, so I love my models. I love my 4-square models. I think they're super helpful, and they make for great doable quiz questions. So you got a family communication pattern model. So there are 2 tensions, right? So there's an axis, and then there's an axis, right? You got your x-axis, or your horizontal axis, and you got your vertical axis. And there's 2 tensions, and one is your conversation orientation. So this is your quality and quantity of talking and exchanging versus your quantity and quality of talking and exchanging, right? So we call this your conversation orientation. And your conversation orientation is the degree to which you have frequency and quality of conversation. So it's the amount that you converse, you exchange messages, you self-disclose, and it's also the variety and the breadth with which you do it. So you can have, for example, like a high conversation orientation where you talk a lot, right? You check in every day, you say goodbye to each other in the morning, you get picked up from school, and you have dinner together and you say goodnight, let's say. But you're always really talking about the same exact thing. So my father and I, for example, have high conversation orientation because we talk pretty frequently, mostly because he wants to, not because I want to. But, I see him, as far as like adult children of parents are concerned, I see my father once a month, which is very rare. And we also talk or email at least, like, I would say once every other day, which I think is shocking for a 30-something-year-old woman to talk to their father that much, especially a father that I don't really have a great relationship with. So anyway, we can talk more about that later. But we don't talk about very many things. He repeatedly talks about the weather and his job. He tells me the same story over and over again. And I never tell him what's going on with me because he won't listen. So high conversation orientation in terms of frequency, but not so high in terms of variety. And this was true of us growing up as well. Like, my father always liked to talk. I mean, he always wanted to know what was going on with us. He always wanted to talk about what's going on with work, but only like one or two topics could he tolerate. He didn't really have a lot of tolerance for us changing the subject or us bringing up new subjects to talk about. And also a lot of topics in my family had to be off limits because my father has like no tolerance for dissent, and it was very tricky. So I would say, so if you're looking about, is that high or is that low? We're like medium high if you just look at him and I as the family, right? So high conversation orientation means you talk about a lot of things and you talk frequently. And low conversation orientation means you don't talk a lot about things and you don't talk very frequently, all right? And that's also a tension because, you might have one member of your family of origin who is very high on conversation orientation, and you might be kind of medium on conversation orientation because you like to talk about a lot of topics, but you don't like to talk often. And then you might have someone in the family who's very low on conversation orientation. They don't like to talk a lot, and they don't like to talk a lot about topics. So there's a tension in the family where you have to navigate this pull, right? So you kind of have to decide, based on your family of orientation, where do you kind of fall in that spectrum? And it's hard to do because, again, not every member in your family is going to fall in the same exact spot. So choose what stuck with you. So like for me, because my father was the most difficult member of our family, he's the one that stuck with me as my family having kind of lower conversation orientation. But if you had just looked at me, my father, and my brother, or if you'd looked at me and my step family, super high conversation orientation. But my biological father, much lower conversation orientation because he always wants to talk about the same topics. And so I would probably put us in the middle if I were looking at like just one, if I had to pick what family means for me. I would gear it toward my biological dad because, frankly, my relationship with him has given me the most problems, right? It's created the most negative coping mechanisms. So I wouldn't look at my biological family, which was much more pluralistic, or my relationship with my mother, which was much more pluralistic, because it didn't give me that many problems, right? It wasn't an issue for me, so I don't really have anything I have to address there because it worked. And it didn't work because it was pluralistic. It worked because it was a positively managed communication pattern. There are families that don't talk about a lot of subjects and don't talk very frequently who are very happy, and the children of those families have no problem. But it's because it's not the specific kind of pattern. Like, it's not whether you're high in conversation orientation or low in conversation orientation. It's how well those things were managed, right? So that's conversation orientation. And then on the straight vertical axis, you've got conformity orientation. And that's how much everyone has to agree on topics. Like, how well is disagreement tolerated? And then there's low conformity orientation, which is like, like we don't tolerate. So again, high conformity orientation, flip it. So high conformity orientation is the idea everyone has to get along. So that word conformity is like everyone has to get along. So high conformity, okay? And if you're not looking at your study guide right now, you really need to pull out your Foursquare because this is fucking impossible to do without the Foursquare. So high conformity orientation is everyone has to get along. We don't talk about those things. We don't disagree. We have dinner at the same time. We order the same, whatever it is, right? And then low conformity orientation is we don't have to agree. It's okay for everyone to have their opinion. We tolerate disagreement well. So like in my father's case, he did not tolerate disagreement well. He does not want to hear people's opinions. He probably the most tolerant my father is of other people's opinions is like if he wants to root for the Raiders and you're like a Bears fan, he maybe can still hang out with you. I mean, that's like how bad it is. But again, that might not be a problem because in some families, like high conformity is fine because you agree with the people around you, and so conformity just sort of happens. But it wasn't productive in my family. So if you're high on conversation, so you have high conversation, and you have low conformity, so tolerance and disagreement is acceptable, then you have what we call a pluralistic family. Now, pluralistic families can be super great because everybody's doing their own thing and everyone's valuable and we're still connecting, or they can be awful because there's like just way too much chaos, way too much disagreement, way too much freedom. So there's a clip, and I have it in this playlist from Big Daddy, and on my YouTube page, it's called Pluralistic Family Fail. And I really love that clip because it shows what happens when the character Adam Sandler has allowed this child that he's taken in to just kind of pick his own name and wear his own clothes and choose when he bathes. And they're always hanging out together, and he shows up at the parent-teacher conference. And so you may want to go watch that clip because it shows, like, even though he has high conversation orientation, he's like very involved in the child's life. They spend a lot of time together. He's teaching him everything he knows. He's very interested in what's going on with him, or he's bonding a lot. And he lets him kind of do whatever he wants and lets him be his own person. That he shows up to class one day and the teacher's like, you have the smelly kid. And then Adam Sandler's like, oh my God, what the hell is wrong with me? Because he's let the kid essentially make his own decisions, and you can't let an 8-year-old decide how to run the family. So pluralism is great in theory, but of course, it can go bad. Just like any one of these family styles can just kind of not work. So it's not the family communication pattern that decides whether it's well done. It's how the tensions there are managed. So that's pluralistic, high conversation, low conformity. Then we have high conversation, high conformity. So we're talking a lot about different subjects, but we have to get along. We don't really tolerate disagreement well. That's a consensual kind of family style, right? Like consensus. Again, maybe you were raised in a consensual family style and you loved it. And that's how you want to grow up, and that's how you behave now. And you just think like, yeah, we just have to talk a lot, but it's okay for us to all have the same opinions, and we don't need to have high disagreement, right? That's fine. To me, it's hard to imagine a consensual family style being high in conformity and also tolerating disagreement well. But I can imagine situations where you could be in a situation and you could be having a difference of opinion, and people could say like, look, I don't agree with you and I don't want to listen to your difference of opinion, but I'm still respectful and I've shown you that this disagreement is okay. But that would take such like a Zen, like almost Dalai Lama level of disagreement tolerance. It's hard to imagine that working, but that's a consensual family. But I try not to judge because I don't know, like everybody's just doing the best they can. All right. High conversation orientation and high conformity is your consensual family. Then you have low conversation, right? So don't talk very much, don't have very much variety of topics, and low conformity, we don't need to get along, disagreement is tolerated well, and that's the laissez-faire family, and that's the like hands-off. So laissez-faire in economics means hands-off economics. It's French, laissez-faire, right? Hands-off. And this is a family that's just kind of very independent. Everyone sort of does their own thing. These families are often described as like cold and distancing, and how the parents, or whatever the primary caregiver, they don't have a lot of responsiveness or attachment to their children. But I don't know. I just kind of don't agree with that. I think you could probably have a really productive laissez-faire family, right? Because you're low in conformity, meaning disagreement is tolerated well, and you could certainly model disagreement very well for your kids and the members of your family. And your conversation orientation is low, yes, but maybe that means that you just don't talk very often, but when you do, you have deep discussions about a specific topic. But maybe you're just not doing it a lot. So for example, a family of high thinking introverts who are like all, I'm totally stereotyping here, but all like science nerds who love video games, I don't know, maybe they're laissez-faire and it's fine. Anyway, I can imagine, it's easier for me to imagine a laissez-faire family functioning really well than a consensual family. But again, I'm sure I'm wrong about that. And then the last one we have is low conversation orientation, high conformity. So we don't talk about very much stuff. We don't talk very often. And when we do talk, we have to agree. And in my stereotype brain, I think of this as like the military family, because for me, the military is like this, right? Low conversation, high conformity. We're not engaging very often. And when we do engage, we have to do it this way. Again, I mean, I don't know. This seems like one of those families that would be tough for me to be in, but maybe it works for people. For example, like I bet you're highly organized. I bet your house is super clean. I bet you grew up in a really like well-structured environment where you were always on time for school and you always kind of like knew when the bills were going to get paid because you didn't get along very well, but there was like a high sense of consensus. Or sorry, you you didn't engage very often, but there was a high sense of consensus. So again, I think it's important to remember that like all ways of communicating and all ways of being in a family, generally speaking, are valid. It's just everyone's going to have a strength and weakness because there's tensions. There's going to be strengths and weaknesses to pluralistic and strengths and weaknesses to consensual. So a pluralistic is going to be great for developing people who are highly autonomous and creative decision makers, but it's going to be terrible, like, I don't know, if you have to make a decision about something like very quickly. Like, are we going to vacate during Hurricane Katrina? Well, in a pluralistic family where everyone's sitting around arguing about it, you may be drowned before you get the fuck out, you know? But in a protective family, it's going to be like, nope, I'm making the decision. I'm the leader. You know, get your shit, we're going. No discussion. And no one's going to push back. So again, strengths and weaknesses. So I will leave it at that. You can take the family communication pattern assessment to see where you fall. And again, when you're picking your family, you can pick your family of origin, your family of orientation. You can pick a part of your family of origin if that works better. I don't know why I picked up this fork. And I'm going to stop this here. And then I will see you for Module 4, Video 2, which is entitled, If You Feel Chemistry, Run Away.